Do you prefer Erika or Dr. Dyck? Or...
Erika's fine.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for being here. It's very nice to meet you, Erika.
Thanks, Nathan.
You're very welcome. Okay, so I guess we're going to start at the top. I've got a few things. I'm not going to check things off as we go through. It'll be mostly just a conversation, but there's topics that I did want to try and cover if we can. But the first that I thought was interesting was you were the first guest that I Googled that had a Wikipedia page. So was that your doing or was that already there?
Somebody else did that. I'm not sure who did it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was it was a neat find for me as well.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I Googled your name. I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. And then I, as I was doing prep a few weeks ago, I was looking into your biography, of course, and your research and everything. And I was getting too excited. I had to stop looking because I was going to be up all night. So I did read psychiatric experimentation with LSD in historical perspective. And that was, I had to stop reading after this because I was like, I'm going to just be up all night looking at stuff. So I'm very interested. I'm very excited to talk to you. Thank you for being here. I guess let's start at the beginning. Did you always know that you wanted to be a historian?
Not even close.
No?
No way. I was always interested in history, and I liked historical. I didn't even understand it at the time, but I liked the way historians understand the world. So I gravitated towards historical understandings of things, or trying to figure out why something works or how something works, and I would wonder how did it come to be? So over time I realized that I was interested in these kinds of perspectives, but I didn't understand or have an appreciation for what it could mean to study history at a professional level.
Okay. And so when you went into school originally, did it end up on that path after a while, or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was reflecting on this and thinking about your podcast, and I do think that I had some extraordinary history teachers in high school who really, sort of helped to inspire that spark, or, helped to nourish that idea in the first place. And one teacher in particular, and I don't know if you know, but when I went to school here in Saskatoon, history wasn't even required. It was an option. So there was social studies, and you could take a bunch of different things, but I opted for more of the kind of history stream of things. And had a really enthusiastic teacher who talked to us about not only different travels that he had gone on, but then, how he learned about those places and used a kind of historical approach to understanding. So there was opening up my eyes to travel, but also just, I don't know, again, sort of understanding why things are the way they are. Taking concepts from today even and trying to understand, why is there such, I remember one class on racism, and, that's not a topic that is exclusive to history, obviously, but looking at different episodes from the past. And he got so enthusiastic about it, and I think people gravitated to his class for that reason. And that carried on. And I took history classes in university and found some of that same, not every single class, I will admit, sparked that.
Yeah.
But there were enough that kind of, I don't know, the linking between storytelling and evidence. So it's not free form kind of creative writing style, but it has this artistry to it in the way that you can craft stories, but also really, bed those down, I guess, in different forms of evidence.
And so at this point, you're now taking more history classes and you're looking into it more. Was it just for your pure own knowledge, or were you thinking about doing research now at that point?
I'd say during my undergrad, I was maybe not the best student. And I'd say I was a mixed bag. So my undergrad was a little bit strange in some respects. I started at the University of Saskatchewan, as I'd grown up here in Saskatoon. But 2 years in, I was working, I was playing a lot of soccer, I was doing lots of extracurricular, non-academic things, and decided I needed to do something else. And a friend of mine and I decided to go east. And we both applied, and ultimately I went by myself to Dalhousie University in Halifax.
Okay.
And I'd never been east of maybe Winnipeg at that point.
Yeah, right.
So this was the far east for me, right, as Canadian terms go. And there again, I took classes in English and international studies and a bunch of different things, but the courses that really sort of stood out to me were the history classes. And again, there was this kind of dynamism in the professors that really brought together stories, but in this case with a real social justice kind of side to it, stories that mattered, and certainly I remember one class that really stands out was called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. So, it's an attractive course for many reasons.
Of course.
And there was like 300 people in this huge lecture theater, and the professor would like have us all like chanting by the end of the class. It was
That's
like
awesome.
he used music and song lyrics, and it was really kind of cool. And it made me think too, like, this is a whole different way of thinking about history. This isn't world wars or, I don't know, constitutions or something like that. But it was really like brought to history to life. And I think I had the bug by then.
Yeah. That's really cool. That's interesting too, because I'm reading The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker right now. And when I bought it, the book is like this big. And I remember getting it and thinking, like, you can't put this much information into that many pages. I thought it would be sparse, but it's so dense. And I'm only like a couple parts in, and it's still just going over history of violence. And you're going back, and I don't know, like, it's just naivety, but I don't know why beforehand I didn't think that there was so much going on past a certain date. You're just not thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm reading this book, I'm like, there's constantly stuff was happening.
Yeah.
And like you said, social justice issues, and then also violence. But I don't know. History has become, I guess what I'm trying to say, is a really fascinating topic for myself. So
yeah, it's like a form of kind of mind travel, space travel. You can kind of zoom into these other places in some respects. It's cool.
So it was that class was called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, as you said. Was it focused on? Was it then like particularly like the 60s and 70s, or was it?
Yeah, there's lots of like 1950s, 60s, 70s kind of protest movements, and think about like radical countercultures. It was mostly North American based with lots of Canadian content.
Right.
But yeah, things like, the American Indian movement or civil rights movements, and also Red Power movement in Canada and stuff. So different elements of protest, but also we like spent a lot of time listening to, I don't know, Burton Cummings or Joni Mitchell, or, and dissecting song lyrics to try to understand, are the songwriters who become famous for their songs, are they leading the protest? Are they reflecting the protest? What role does music play in kind of giving a soundtrack to an era? And it was, I don't know, kind of fun stuff that doesn't have really concrete answers, but it was really fun to explore.
That is cool. Wow. Is there a yes or no answer to whether music is reflecting or leading?
I don't think we reached consensus on that.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I think I've gone back and forth on that question in my own work, and sometimes refer back to songs and song lyrics and think about, I study psychedelics, so there's a little bit of music involved in that too. And I think my sense there is that it's really a reflection, but then it also changes the way people experience psychedelics when you listen to the Grateful Dead, for example, or something like that. So yeah, I think it depends.
And so after this class is Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. Is that kind of what you also mentioned? Social justice. Was that class kind of the seed for your interest areas going forward, or? It
definitely brought a bunch of different ideas to mind that it deviated from some of the courses that I'd taken in the past, like a kind of European history, and like this is where the German Empire started, or thinking about things in those militaristic and really sort of national history terms. It changed the frame for me, and that was really cool. And then I think coming back, so then I came back to Saskatchewan and did a master's here, and I was working full time while I did that, and I think my job really influenced some of the things that I was asking about in the master's thesis, which in some respects, I guess, kind of straddles these different worlds of like the kind of national history and then this social and cultural history. I looked at the impact of student loans on student choices in education, which sounds super boring.
That was your master's thesis? Yeah.
In Canada. So did the student loan program help people to like get more people to go to university, or did it create student debt or the fear of student debt, so people start taking classes directly aligned with job prospects,
right,
as opposed to like history classes, for example, or philosophy classes, or something that might not necessarily have like a designated job attached to it. And I don't think I had a really strong conclusion, but the reason is I was working at a member of parliament's office at the time. And one of the consistent things that was coming in the office were people defaulting on loans, and people trying to declare bankruptcy. And so faced with all of these people who were like suffering the consequences of student loans. I was like, how did that start? Where did it? Why was this program implemented in the first place? And but it put me in line with because it started in the 1960s, and then it got me thinking about those student protests and the era of the 60s as well.
So in the 60s is when these loans came in, you said? Mm-hmm. Okay. And did you find out why?
You're going to like scratch the depths of the recesses of my memory here.
I know we're going far back.
I think it was like 1961 or 62, Louis Saint Laurent, like Prime Minister, introduced it as they were trying to expand university funding, but also find ways. There's kind of a bridge in some respects between like giving more core funding to universities so they can expand programming, or giving loans to students. Hopefully students are then taking on a larger tuition, and you can kind of see the economics playing out behind the scenes. But the rhetoric was about expanding access to universities. The survey results of the first few years of the program suggested that it really didn't change, that it wasn't reaching a different kind of demographic. Still the same kinds of people that were going to go to university in the first place were going to university. They were just getting loans now. So it didn't reach out to, underrepresented groups in society.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so we've come back to the 60s a few times.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is the topic that you get asked about the most, but it's the LSD studies. Mm-hmm. And so was there a moment when you knew, like, I'm going to look into psychedelics and what happened in Saskatchewan, or?
Kind of. After my master's, I truly thought that I was done with school. I had a job lined up in Regina and with the government, working for the Minister of Justice, and that's who I'd been working for prior to this time anyway. And I thought I was going into politics and had been looking at policy and stuff before. But I was also kind of like, I don't know, I wasn't super enthusiastic about that.
Yeah.
I felt like it might kind of atrophy my brain, and it wasn't necessarily the thing that got me up in the morning.
It's not too stimulating.
Yeah. There were aspects of it that were really fun, but also aspects that were very much mind-numbing. And the head of the department at the time in the history department, Larry Stewart, asked me to do a research project for him on human experimentation in the modern context. He's more of a early modernist. And so like 20th century kind of stuff. And I went to Ontario and started scouring through medical records in the library there, like the medical school library. So published reports, not primary patient documents or anything.
Right.
And found all these LSD trials in Saskatchewan. And I was like, what? I had to go to Toronto to learn that this happened in my backyard. Yeah. And I came back and I said, like, Larry, there's some amazing stuff in here and you should definitely do this. And he said, no, I don't want to do modern Canadian history projects. You do that. And I said, no. And I went off to do my politics. And a year later, I came back and said, can I have those boxes of material?
Yeah.
I was like, it was too exciting.
It turns out I actually do want to look into this. Yeah.
Totally. So I started my PhD on that, and, the rest is history, as they say.
Wow. And so when I wouldn't call it my background, but like I mentioned earlier, I have a psych degree, and so in psych, when you're going into, I'm sure as you know, into your graduate degrees, it's all research, and it's like the gold standard is double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. But when you're researching history, I assume you're not doing experiments. So what does it look like trying to put this all together and build your doctorate, I guess?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel a little further away from that side of the desk today, but I have quite a few graduate students, and so I'm often in the process of reflecting on that process as a mentor. So if I kind of cross the stream here a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so historians, I mean, we pride ourselves on, being a kind of pillar of the humanities, like philosophy and English or literary studies, other things as well. Linguistics crosses that a bit too. But we use narrative and storytelling in combination with evidence. So you're right, we don't have double-blind reviews. We don't have RCTs or something like that that you would see in a drug trial. But we do have to verify evidence. So it's tricky because sometimes you want to tell the kind of historical story that has little evidence. And I can give you an example. Like, you mentioned I study psychedelics. So we know that in the medieval period, women were using something that we now know as ergot, but like a fungus that grows on rye to change blood circulation, so maybe to bring on contractions,
Right.
which could be used to produce an abortion or like a miscarriage. It could be used also to like hasten contractions during childbirth. But these are things that are kind of taboo, and women playing around with plants could be considered, risque or even witches. And so that kind of information is not kept, and it's not like kept in the official library or other documents. So you have to like find other kinds of information, and you might only have a little tiny shred of it. Whereas sometimes you want to find like a robust amount, like to really verify that something happened. I don't know, like, any kind of like diplomatic incident or something like that. You don't want to just take one person bystander word for it, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on the scale and scope of the story that you're telling. And to me, that's the artistry of history, which is fun, fascinating, and terrifying at the same time. You're like, okay, I have a shred of evidence. Can I say something about this?
That makes sense. I guess just trying to gauge like the quality of it and the reliability and
Yeah.
yeah.
And how much you amplify, some forms of evidence or some voices, or how much you pay attention to. Sometimes loud voices aren't necessarily the right voices or like the most accurate voices. So just trying to like, we always are, like, the historian's mantra is like, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Like there's no easy answer. But just always stepping back and thinking about what's the context required to understand the meaning of that statement or event or whatever.
Speaking of context, I find that lots of times just talking with anybody about history and particularly law, people refer to the U.S. quite a bit and assume it's the same.
Yeah.
Is it the same in history studies? Do people kind of generalize the U.S. across the border a lot?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that, and perhaps in part because we're inundated with information and news from the U.S., so it's easy to sort of kind of blur those lines sometimes. And there are some standout issues, particularly in the kind of work that I do, in history of medicine, history of healthcare. Like our healthcare system is slightly different from the United States, for example. So sometimes there's certain touchstones that people recognize, like we know it's different, but then to get into the weeds with it, do all Americans have to pay out of pocket? Well, no. Do all Canadians get all free access? No. Like there's some crossover points, and that's where it gets really complicated. But in the main, I think there's a lot of assumption that, a lot of policies and practices just flow easily back and forth across the border. And they're always kind of pausing to interrupt that assumption.
Yeah. Again, on the psychedelic part too, that's probably really surprising too, because when we think about the 60s and the 70s, we always think about the hippie movements in the U.S. Like, and I'd heard about stuff starting here or having a huge background in Saskatchewan, but I didn't realize the scope of it until I read this paper that you, this one of many, I guess. And it sounds like it was just as surprising to you to find out that everything was happening here.
Yeah, I really have come to believe that Saskatchewan created this kind of epicenter or this, really important place for a variety of psychedelic trials. I mean, the word psychedelic was coined here. Some of the largest trials in Canada were conducted here, and even some of the earliest and largest trials in North America were conducted here. And they, of course, influenced and belong to networks of researchers in other places as well. It didn't maintain that position. Yeah. But, I think it's an interesting story because it does sort of dovetail with the previous question in that I believe and have argued that Saskatchewan provided a bit of an ideological incubator for medical research at a time when psychiatric research and psychological research was very much in flux. Should we treat people in major hospitals like asylums and psychiatric hospitals where people essentially live out their lives there? Or should we try to treat people, in communities? Or, try to find ways to get people back into communities? And those policy discussions are happening at the same time that the research wasn't really aligned with it. Like, okay, if you want to treat people in communities, then what treatments are available and how do you scale that up? Can you do home visits of psychotherapy? Like, there may be some issues with that. So, like the costs, but also the human resource costs. And so of bringing pharmacy online in a really big way changed the dynamics of that kind of mental health care that was available at the time. And I think Saskatchewan was in many respects on the forefront because of that intersection of interest in healthcare reforms, so changing the way we deliver healthcare, and healthcare policy reforms, so changing the way we pay for it. And it drew people in from other places that might not always have found their way to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, from the Rockefellers and the Huxleys and, people from other places were coming there because of this kind of opportunity to pull together different ideas that they associated with, I don't know, we'll call it socialized medicine, even though I think that really was an elastic term at the time, and psychedelics. The idea that researchers at the time believed for a while that by taking LSD or mescaline, which grows is an alkaloid in the peyote cactus, that you could have an insight into schizophrenia, or you could empathize with your patients in ways that seemed unimaginable before. That was a way of breaking down barriers between this othering of patients with psychotic disorders they felt had maybe been lost. Like there were all sorts of theories about what was happening with them, but often that they were being written off as people. But this was a way to rehumanize that experience and maybe even see benefits or some of the value in having these kinds of not ordinary experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that just really kind of cracked open a philosophical window in some respects for thinking about, well, hang on, what is madness? What is it all bad? Is it good? How can we think about this in different ways? And if you can temporarily create madness, can you unmake madness as well? And I'm using madness just as a kind of neutral term here that they used. But so I just kind of fell in love with that idea because it brought together so many different consequences. It wasn't just tracking one set of ideas, but it was really had the potential to transform the way we think about human suffering. And that to me was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating too, because it's almost like an integration with like psychoanalysis and pharmacology. This idea that
absolutely
not only can you go into the patient's mind and help them out, but it doesn't have to be only that in the unconscious or only pharmacology. Like there might be a way to integrate the two.
Well, when you asked about like, you didn't say these words, but the kind of RCT model, I mean, I think it's actually really pertinent to imagining this moment, if we kind of imagine this historical moment in the psi disciplines, if you will, like the psychology and psychiatry and psychopharmacology, as they come together, like how do you determine like what is the optimal way to treat someone? What is the least risky, the safest, and has, the best results? And the best results might be the most efficient, like get there quickly, or most efficient, like don't pay a lot,
Yeah.
And so trying to like work out that calculus was I think a really thorny issue, and it raised a lot of ethical questions as well. So many ultimately adopted what became the gold standard of the RCT, or the randomized controlled trial, which is look dispassionately at the observable effects by, if you take this thing or many people take this thing, then we'll count these things. And we really embrace this kind of statistical model to imagine scale. And that works really well if you want to scale something for, minimizing risk and maximizing profit. But if you want to sit and hold your patient's hand and listen to them tell you about the rainbow snakes coming out of their arms, I'm quoting, actually paraphrasing someone's actual trip, that's not really scalable. And you can't say like, okay, it's effective if they see rainbow, but did you see the full spectrum? Like, like figuring out how to quantify that became really challenging. And also leaving people alone to have a psychedelic experience was considered the standard if you're doing an objective trial. But you don't want to leave people alone. Maybe you want to stop the trip. Maybe you want to sort of calibrate it differently. And this started to really challenge the methodology of how do you measure effectiveness. So in places like Weyburn and Regina and Saskatoon, Swift Current, Prince Albert even, and other places in the world like Amsterdam and Baltimore, we'll put us up there, in San Francisco, Los Angeles, all those kinds of things. There are these debates going on about, whether you should, what kind of space should you create for taking a psychedelic in a therapeutic context. Should you listen to music? Should the walls be gray? Should they have wallpaper on them? Should there be a couch for someone to lie down on, like the analysts would have used? And they play around with all these different concepts as they're trying to determine, like, what's the best way to create a safe place, but people's interpretations of safety become subjective after a while. And yeah, it kind of creates this big collision course of, I think, scientific methodology about how to measure effectiveness and also how to scale it up, because it becomes really expensive and difficult to scale up a kind of, again, an ethical framework for introducing psychedelics into a mixed environment with, should you have one of the accusations of, like a real accusation in a published paper was that, the nurses were too attractive. And so people were having a kind of placebo effect, right? Like they said they had a good time because the nurses were attractive. Like, should you only hire unattractive nurses? What is an unattractive nurse? Like, it just raises these other kinds of questions. So they cut the nurses out. But then people had poor times if they were alone in a room without a couch, like sitting in a chair for 8 hours.
Yeah.
Watching your arms turn into rainbow snakes or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Was unpleasant. But is that the drug or is it the environment? And I think it, again, like just that nest of questions raised all these sorts of possibilities for thinking, well, okay, who do we need to answer this? Do we need sociologists and anthropologists, philosophers, art historians, musicians? Like, started bringing other people into the mix. And it was clear that this is not just a problem that could be answered by one discipline or domain.
Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate too, I think, sometimes that not that there is a gold standard in research, but sometimes it seems, and I'm not a researcher, so I could be talking out of my ass here, but it seems like sometimes the randomized controlled trial has become such a gold standard that it's almost deified, and everything else is dismissed. And I noticed that when I was reading some of your work, that it was the researchers in Saskatchewan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the researchers in Saskatchewan were criticized a little bit. It seems like that's what you were saying, because they weren't doing things experimentally by the book. It was kind of like these one-on-one patient trials that they were doing with people. And so there's all this pushback against it, even though that is a fine way to show a result. And it's a lot of times it's more generalizable, because if you make something completely a lab setting and just remove everything, like you said, have them in a chair in a blank room, like even if there is a result, how are you going to generalize that to the real world?
Yeah, and I think, stepping back from it and from some of the earlier stuff that I wrote, I like to think I'm still learning and have a slightly different perspective than I had a while ago. But I think part of what's happening is, if we step back from the psychedelic context and we step back from understanding like the application of LSD to addictions or alcoholism, which was done at the time, psychedelics were also fitting into I'll say like almost a paradigm shift, a transformation, if you will, in the psi disciplines and psychiatry in particular, in this idea that, like, I'm losing my train of thought. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But moving from case-based studies, which had been used for a long time, and psychotherapeutic studies, often, whether they're psychoanalytic, any kind of psychodynamic theory, saying this to you because you mentioned your psychology background, but like all these kinds of the theories behind the psychotherapy often relied on case studies and case reports, because they relied on that sort of granular texture of the case itself. You had to understand the individual, you have to understand their background, all of those sorts of things, and then to sort of scale up to a point where you can say, okay, here's a theory that works across a large population. There's always some caution and trepidation, and it really works in that discipline to really think about that one-on-one interaction or even group setting interaction, but still in a fairly small context. Whereas if you imagine the kind of like psychopharmacology coming online really in a big way in the 1950s, we're not talking about one-on-one interactions now. We're talking about massive daily dose pharmaceuticals that will be taken by thousands, if not millions of people. And they're not measuring that as not conducive to that one-on-one sort of case study. It's really, really too bad about your mother, but we don't really care. Like, this is going to dampen your depression. This is going to work on the, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It functions, and the justifications for it were based on a different set of knowledge. And how to measure that, I think, relied on a different methodology. But it put these things in a kind of clash, because at some points they dovetail. And often, in fact, they dovetail. People are taking medication and going through psychotherapy. But how to measure that relied on collaboration across disciplines and really questioning, like to your earlier question, like what evidence do you use? Do you use patient testimonials? sounds like an advertisement, sort of, but
Yeah, right. Yeah, it can. Yeah.
and that's what we're seeing in the psychedelic world today. I think, there are many celebrity testimonials out there, and some non-celebrity testimonials about like the power of psychedelics to heal my whatever, cure my, fix my, transform, all these sorts of like really bold statements. And it's interesting, but it harkens back almost to like an earlier way of evaluating the kind of therapeutic benefits. And not that I'm saying they need to go through randomized controlled trials, because I'm a bit of a critic of that, but I think we need to like step back and think about a mixed methodology to effectively evaluate their power.
Yeah. Of course, I'm not an expert, but I completely agree with that. And it makes sense too, because I don't know. I found that going through a psych degree as well, you're taught very frequently to be skeptical. And so now when I look at research, when I'm reading literature, I look at it with the lens that if we're looking at randomized controlled trials the way that we've been saying that the world is looking at them, and they're the gold standard and they're deified, it starts to get to this point where you almost want to look at it and say like, well, why, if everybody is so sure about this, like maybe we need to reevaluate it, because it's anytime something becomes so widespread, it can get weird if nobody's willing to speak out against it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this in a variety of different forms, like within medicine, but also outside of medicine. I don't know, maybe this is a little bit wacky, but I've been doing research with people, I'll say in my words, not theirs necessarily, sort of in the underground of the psychedelic world. So after 1970 or 71, depending on where you are in the world, as the war on drugs sort of proceeds and psychedelics are criminalized, they don't entirely disappear. Like they may disappear off the kind of white market landscape, but there's a gray market, there's a black market, there's, people moving to different parts of the world that are more permissive, I suppose. And what's sort of fascinating is, so how do they evaluate safety? Because they're working off the grid in so many ways. And yet there are quite robust and not always entirely accurate, but they're really sophisticated mechanisms or, communication systems, even in a pre-internet era, for helping to promote safety. And we might say harm reduction today, but, don't take the blue acid, or, these kinds of messages that go out in an anonymous pamphlet, Yeah. Or, how to identify the right mushrooms and how to prepare them and what to do if you've taken too much. And, please report back if you've discovered an upper limit,
Yeah.
All that sort of like outside the realm of research. If we think about it in like the university sense, like it's not in the library, it's not in the archives, it's not part of the randomized control thing, but it's kind of like in the wild. This is how people are doing things. And we know that's the case. I mean, we're living in the 21st century here where there's a fentanyl crisis amidst other opioid crises. These are medically prescribed substances in the first place. People take things off the book,
Yeah. Well, that's one of the big arguments for decriminalization or legalization, I think, is just the idea that you can have these things go through a mainstream instead of it being, not that there's inherently something wrong with a community-based approach to harm reduction, as you said, or research, but if it's legal or decriminalized, then at least it can be mainstream, right? I think that's one of the arguments.
Absolutely. And I think there's sort of two parts of that. One, that you can openly talk about, the benefits, instead of just saying it's bad, it's illegal, you'll go to jail, you're evil, whatever that is, the kind of scare tactic approach. Yeah. And then people are like, okay, so I better not tell anyone if I took this. I won't tell my parents. I won't tell, the doctors at the emergency room if something goes wrong. So there's a lot of deception that gets kind of hard baked into the system, no pun intended. And and then on the flip side of that, so the harm reduction can not necessarily increase use, but increase knowledge. So you can openly talk about it, and then you could make a more informed decision about whether or not you want to try this thing. And you can, when you go to the emergency room, if it happens, or wherever it might be, or you see the EMT, you can say what you did because you're not worried about, losing your kids or, having your wages garnished or going to jail or any of the kinds of consequences that come with that criminal space. And people are going to do it. There's enough evidence of that. And some people within those communities of people who use substances have a lot of experience and information about how to test supplies and safe use and things like that. And I think even reaching out to those communities of people or those individuals and, sort of building some of those bridges could go a long ways towards promoting a kind of harm reduction sort of campaign or public health messaging.
Yeah. I see that changing a lot in the world in all fields, it seems like, is there's much more, what's the word? There's much more willingness to approach expertise in areas outside of academics or professionalism.
Yeah.
And so they'll go and find even just forums.
Yeah.
People will start expert communications on forums, and you can see those discussions actually make it to the mainstream news cycle. Absolutely. In any topic, right? Whereas it used to be if you weren't in a university or in an office building, then your opinion didn't really matter. Right?
Yeah. I think, this sort of goes in a different direction, but one of the things that my colleagues are much better informed on this than I am, but I think the impact of the internet on how we trust information is going to, future historians will say, in the pre-internet era, which will sound like the dark ages, right?
Yeah.
But it fundamentally, I think, changes how we assess risks, how we, figure out who to trust. And, we could Google each other beforehand, right? Which is probably just commonplace, right? I looked up your podcast as, oh, who's this guy? What's it about? I didn't have to phone a friend or, the mechanisms for determining trust have changed so much over the last 30, 40 years. And I think it's going to be interesting as we go, as I think of it as a historian, fast forward, whatever it is, 30, 50 years, some other time, to a time when people can't even imagine what it was like to not have, Wi-Fi, digital communications. We may miss a lot of the history because it's impossible. ChatGPT and AI systems are going to be required to sift through information, to distill it. And that's going to change the way we use evidence and change the kind of evidence that's available to us. If Twitter disappears, that's a repository of information that I don't know what to do with it. Is it accurate? Should we use it? Is it real? Does it have benefit as an information source? I don't know. But there are all these kinds of social media devices and things that may be ephemeral. They may disappear. They're proprietary. You can't buy them. They're not in a library. But they have become purveyors of information. And especially on things, like you say, around trusting different drug sources as one. Yeah. But I'm sure there are lots of other topics that could fit into that. That kind of gray zone of this might be taboo. It might be illegal. It might be risque. I don't want to tell my parents. There are all these venues now for having those conversations that are off the grid in terms of the sort of research landscape. We're not required to check Facebook before we publish something, right? To see if anybody else has published it there or if there's an opinion there. But you can imagine, and I just pick on Facebook, but you can imagine the digital world changing the way that we assess evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost. Yeah, I can see it changing it completely too, because it's so rapid to everything that the internet brings about. And opinions change too. Going back to talking about early history and in wars, for example, when I'm reading this book that I was talking about, another thing that I had never considered is that not only did I don't know why I feel stupid saying this even, but not only did people behave differently, but they actually conceptualized the world completely differently. And so what it talks about is before, in the 19th century and pretty much everything before then, war, especially to men, was seen as just a natural thing. It was an urge or an itch that built up, right? And a lot of it was honor. And it's how do you even define honor? And so it was just the natural mode of states was to be warring with each other. And now we see it as disgusting. Where it used to be a completely natural phenomenon in the eyes of most people. So I see that happening with drugs we're talking about, and then just tons of different fields. And again, to come back to the internet, is just that's going to accelerate those changes in belief systems and just the way people see the world so quickly.
Yeah, and I think there's an artificial, but maybe that's unfair. There's a way that the internet and all of the sort of social media has the capacity to shrink the world too. If you are I don't know, if you feel very isolated and alone in your, let's say, your identity or your worldviews or your circumstances, and, maybe, in the community of Montgomery, there's nobody around who like shares these views. But if you post something and then, maybe there's someone in Australia or even in Regina, all of a sudden there's the capacity to build community and shared experiences across spaces in a way that is unimaginable prior to this period, this sort of moment in human history. And I think that has the capacity to also sort of either reinforce certain views. If you're all alone, like maybe those views will kind of get chafed off as you try to like make your way in the world, and and this can be good or bad, right? But reinforcing those same kind of like-minded views or shared views, even if they're not the same, has the potential to change those kind of protest movements, or like the power to like make it appear as though this is a groundswell of concern over such an issue, and it's many bots on a channel, like, and I don't know, like, I don't mean to be so dismissive, but again, it changes if you have to rally a bunch of people physically in the same space. It looks different than if you can rally a bunch of people through social media.
Mm-hmm.
And the political power of that community building has, I think, consequences, and maybe not all bad. Like, I don't mean to suggest that it's like I'm value neutral in this. I'm just like, watch this space. Future historians will have an idea.
Exactly. No, it is really interesting too, because I think you hit the nail on the head with rallying people together in person versus online, is that it is so much harder to show your face anywhere than it is to show your avatar on that shit, like.
Yeah, and like, how hard is it? You can stay in your sweatpants, you can be multitasking and whatever. Like, it's a different level of commitment potentially, and maybe people are fully engaged when they're involved in some of these digital conversations, but we don't really know. And again, that trust comes in a little bit there too.
Yeah.
So how we learn to trust is, I think, kind of going through some changes.
I think so too, especially because like, a good example is that bots are getting harder to detect all the time. They seem a lot more like real people. But it reminded me, as we're talking about this, that I was going through my phone while you were on your way over and just looking at quotes that I have in my notes.
Mm-hmm.
And one that I came across was I wish I remembered where I had heard it, but it just says it's hard to hate people up close or something like that, or it's hard to hate up close. So I think that's a perfect example of one of the negative consequences of the internet. Is that it's really, really hard to like yell at a stranger to their face and call them an idiot and say you hate them and they're evil.
Yeah.
But like when you're tweeting, it's so easy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think even, over the last few years going through the pandemic, we've realized that on the other side of things, and certainly in the classroom, having Zoom classes or whatever, online classes, regardless of the platform, it feels like we're missing something, and I'm seeing it now in the number of students who are coming to office hours, and like more than ever, it's like people are really craving that human connection. And this is the flip side of like, as opposed to yelling at someone. But there's this kind of reverberation effect of like, okay, actually that was a valuable thing that we miss and that we want to cultivate. And so there seem to be efforts to sort of cautiously, because I think there's still concern about like infectious diseases, for example, and some anxiety about, going out into the world for lots of reasons. But there's also a kind of appetite for rekindling some of those human connections. And it's going to be interesting to see what impact that has, sort of, it's like dropping a pebble in the pond, like to see the rippling effects. Because I don't know that there's going to be a straight line that we can draw and say, this meant that. But sort of measuring it in a multitude of ways, I suspect we're going to see like a kind of echo effect from the pandemic, as there are either communities formed or maybe like it takes longer. Yeah. Or people are more cautious about the kinds of communities they want to form in person.
I think so too. And I think that's one of like everything has its benefits and its cons. And I think that would be one of the benefits of the pandemic, because it really showed people what they might have been taking for granted. Yeah. The obvious one is connection, like you're talking about. And I hope it lasts. I hope people do continue to go out and see each other more and remember what it was like not to. Yeah. But unfortunately, like humanity as a whole has a very short-term memory. So yeah, we tend to forget things pretty quick.
Yeah, it's I guess a kind of moral challenge for historians, because you feel like the kind of like nagging "I told you so," like don't forget these things. You kind of feel like that nagging instructor or something like that. But it is like there's a reason why it's a cliche that if we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it. And that's, yeah, I mean, it's part of what I think, for me at least, and I know that I'm not everybody thinks this way, but I really think that history is important for helping us to navigate our present and our future. That not just from understanding where we came from or something like that, but really helping to ground us and help us to sort of contextualize, is this really important right now? Oh, wait, let's remember why this is an important issue right now. To me, that's really critical as like historical thinking. And yeah, like I said, I know that I'm not, I'm not singing from the choir here. Not everyone agrees with me. But yeah, that's part of what drives me in the kind of history that I do.
Thankfully, I think it's moving back that way a little bit more too. And I'm 23 now, and unfortunately, it took me until I don't know, it's probably until last year or the year before, but before I realized that humanities are not just hobby areas; they're extremely important, and I've become more and more obsessed with them every day now. But I was listening to a lecture the other day. They were talking about the fact that we always talk about we can't forget, like lest we forget, for example, for November 11th. And the idea is that, like, don't forget, but like, what are you not forgetting if you don't understand what happened? And and so that in this lecture, that's what the gentleman was talking about, is that it doesn't matter if you know that it happened. You have to know why and how bad it was and what caused it. And that's why I'm extremely thankful for people like yourself that are going out and digging this stuff back up to show people, because one, it's fascinating, but two, it's extremely informative, and you can't dismiss it. I find personally sometimes in myself, and I think in other people, that we tend to think because humanity is so good at creating new technologies now and coming up with new information that we've got it figured out. But we have no idea how much history is still influencing us and how old the systems that are deep inside our brains are, and they have quite a bit of control over us. And the only way to, not the only way, one of the most important ways to understand all of that stuff all encompassing is through the humanities. It's not always through chemistry and biology experiments,
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that platform, because like as a humanities professor, like, yeah, I totally agree. More funding, no. But it is interesting, and then it kind of comes back to those I think quite naive questions that I asked during my master's. Like, I didn't know what I was getting into, right? I was like, oh, why are people going broke? This is a travesty. And I don't think I said anything so profound in that study, but it did get me thinking a little bit about, okay, so why do humanities get the kind of reputation that they do about, like, there's something fun for retired people, or like, I get the comment sometimes, less lately, but I used to get this more frequently. They're like, "Oh, how could you be a historian? You're so young." I mean, like I said, less lately. But I'm like, there's a way of learning how to think historically that doesn't mean like like most historians that appear on movies, like I think of Monty Python, Search for the Holy Grail. There's a historian. He's like an old guy who dies in the end, because he's like peaking out on his career. Not everyone can be Indiana Jones, but the way that historians feature often in the kind of media portrayals is, someone who's, learned all of these things, and it takes all of these years and all of this reading to like memorize facts or something like that. And I think it's a caricature that is quite dated and doesn't actually or accurately depict what historians can bring to the table, or humanities people in general. But that, I taught in a medical school for a while, and it was an interesting challenge to try to convince medical students that, what they really needed, forget physiology. Well, no, do that too. You need, do some biochemistry, but here's a history class, not even a class, but a lecture. And I had to come to realize, and it wasn't a hard sell, that part of what history offers is not memorization of these facts. Like, that's kind of how you tell your story, but you can always look that up. But it's an appreciation for asking critical questions. And it's like you said with your own degree experience as well, that like sort of inspiring a kind of lifelong curiosity. That was some of the language that was given to us to use. Like, we want you to inspire lifelong learning. I'm like, oh, ask hard questions that can't be asked. Okay, good. But really leaning into those sort of philosophical questions, they may be ethical questions in the broadest sense, or even trying to, and this is a tricky one to articulate, but trying to introduce a level of humility. So the idea, like in medicine as a good example, what we have now may not be the last thing. Like, we may have new ideas that will make the things that we're doing today seem barbaric or unsophisticated or ridiculous or wrong even. And in order to weather that change, you need to have a little bit of humility. You need to be able to step back and be willing to accept different ideas, or even to shift back to old ideas. And that takes, that takes a psychologist and a historian working together to think about how do you implant that kind of way of thinking into a lifelong learner or a physician. And by the same token, I certainly want my physician to be confident and not be like, well, it's complicated. You could have a broken arm, but it might just be that it's in your head, or I want an answer. Yeah. So, we're asking a lot of people in different professions to engage in this, but I do think that those humanities degrees offer that opportunity to think critically and to imagine, I don't know, maybe to open up Pandora's box a little bit, to think about different places where you might seek answers. Mm-hmm. And you don't want that every time necessarily, but I think having a sprinkling of that is really valuable for really any profession.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's the idea that the university is supposed to be somewhere where you learn how to think, not what to think. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I don't know if this experience is generalizable outside of myself, but I found that for the most part, that's what was happening. Mm-hmm. So I can remember one professor in particular. I had a political science class, and in that class, I definitely learned how to think. Mm-hmm. And we went over everything, and he would always play devil's advocate with us. It was very great. Mm-hmm. But then I also had professors where it was kind of like you'd give them an answer, and they're like, "No, that's wrong, because this." And you're reading the response you got to your work, and you're like, "That sounds like an opinion. Mm-hmm. Like, that doesn't sound like." It sounds like you're disagreeing with me, which is fine, but It doesn't mean I'm wrong. Right. And so sometimes you're being taught what to think it feels like. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a fine line there, I think, because although in principle I totally agree with you, of course I'm thinking like, yeah, but yeah. That's not my job. There's a slipperiness, I think, and it may kind of coincide with some of the other broader changes we've been talking about, like figuring out how to trust, or like, do I really need complete sentences, or can I just like write in tweets and emojis? Like, can I write my essay like that? I mean, I think there are examples where we show that like actually there is proper grammar, for example. Mm-hmm. But even grammar is changing. We think about pronoun debates and things like that, and the way that we write, the way that we express, and what is accurate and appropriate is changing. But our capacity to communicate clearly still relies on some fundamental principles, and so like evidence and logic and those kinds of things, right? And so I think that we're also kind of experiencing changes right now, and I see that I've seen that in the classroom over the last, I've been teaching since 2005, and I think that's changing even in my career, which I guess it's longer than I think. I don't like to do math, but it's almost 20 years now. My point is that sometimes I think even what we accept as fact, or the right thing or the wrong thing, is beginning to change, and where we sort of bed down on like that's an opinion or that's the right answer, it's in flux, and we have new tools to challenge those things. Like, well, I can find 17,000 followers who agree with that. Does that make it right? Like I said, it kind of comes back to some of the challenges that we're facing as researchers and professors, trying to figure out like, how do you steer this ship, right? And some of the resources that we have and the ways that we were trained. I mean, we had card catalogs at school when I went to school. This was pre-internet era. We aren't actually trained to think about the whole full breadth of information that's available now either. So yeah, watch this space.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with you. The grammar one in particular is like, I don't know if this is just me being nitpicky or me being a nerd, but I sometimes when I'm like on Instagram or TikTok and I see a meme and the grammar is wrong, it drives me crazy because I'm like, you're not actually saying what you think you're saying right now. And so stuff like that. I completely agree that even within the realm of opinions and differences, there needs to be a default mode of like how we agree to communicate things, because that's the only way that you can get to an argument is if you have a foundation, a bedrock, at least of like, okay, we're going to both agree to speak this way about our disagreements. And then you can actually, you're not trying to translate stuff all the time or work through rhetorical errors and stuff like that. So
I know that's like a nitpicky. I agree. Like I'm with you on the nerdy thing. Like it sounds like it, but at some level, like, but at some point we start to get into opinion wars. Like, you know, we need some foundation here. Like, what do we agree on as like either the rules of engagement or, you know, what is a fact? you know, or what is robust evidence? Yeah. And that's changing.
It is. It's changing quite a bit. Actually, as you said that, I was thinking about, I got into an argument with my brother in the summer. And he said, I don't know. He said my truth or something like that. I'm like, okay, I can't have a discussion with you right now because we don't even agree on what the word truth means.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's saddening sometimes, actually, really, because when you get into situations like that and you're like, I actually really want to have a discussion with you. And if it turns into an argument, that's fine, as long as we're not screaming at each other.
Yeah.
I would like to disagree with you because that's how we get better at things. But if we can't even agree on the difference between fact and anecdote or truth, I'm like, then we're kind of losing it here. And it's like with the grammar thing is, if you there's a threshold that sometimes is arbitrary, but you still need not cross it. Because for grammar, for example, as soon as you start foregoing grammar, then well, how far can you go? Like, where does it become nonsensical? Like, where does it stop? And where does your sentence actually not make sense?
Yeah.
If you just choose to arbitrarily not follow these rules at this point, you know. So I think I'm rambling now. But
No, I totally agree. And like, you know, I'm a mother of small children, so I'm like, no, it matters that you spell this correctly. And like, Mom, spelling doesn't matter. And I'm like, like having a breakdown. And I have to check myself as well. Like, okay, well, what things do matter? But I'll come back to, for me at least, I think still clarity of expression matters. And it's true that maybe I can forgive, you know, certain deviations or whatever, but there's a slippery slope, I do think. And again, I'll like zoom out of my body here for a moment as like my out of body perspective as a future historian might consider. I do think that we're at a moment of change in the way that, you know, I don't know, Marshall McLuhan, like Canadian philosopher who coined the phrase, you know, the message is the medium, like the technology by which we communicate affects the messaging as much as the message itself. I think there's value in that idea, and the concept of the digital world, the digital space, is changing the way we interact with one another, and in a whole variety of ways. That's going to change the way I think we understand and interpret history as well, because we're going to draw on different facts or different bodies of evidence to determine what happened. And you know, if again, choose your social media platform of choice, but like if TikTok was my sort of source base, my impression of what happened in 2022 might be really different from some other kind of source base, and yet it still has validity.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's overwhelming, and I hope future people figure this out, but working in this space, I'm like kind of mildly fascinated by it and totally terrified.
Yeah. No, me too. Well, it's like an organism. It's like it's constantly growing and evolving. The medium being the message thing is really interesting. I'd never thought about that before too. It makes me think of the term that consensus is not fact. So when you gave an example of a disagreement where somebody was like, well, I can find 17,000 followers that agree with me. Yeah. And it's weird because it is much easier to find apparent consensus on topics because you can find so many people that agree with you. But it's odd because it's, you know, if everybody else is going against you, the odds are pretty high that you're probably the incorrect one. But they're not, it's not zero. You know, you still could be right. Yeah. And so I think sometimes we fall into the lap of the crowd a lot. And the crowd is so big now because of the internet. So.
And you think about that, you know, coming back to the randomized controlled trials thing, you imagine that, you know, that methodology sort of applying to borrow like the truthiness of a situation, right? I think to me these questions, these kind of deeper philosophical questions about how we measure truth, whether it's consensus or because that's kind of what RCTs do, right? They're measuring a consensus in some respects. Those ways of interpreting evidence and human behavior I think they are on trial right now, and we'll see the results a little bit later. And I don't know, I'm not suggesting there's some doomsday future that we're all going to realize that Prozac was bad, or I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't mean necessarily like that, but I think this idea of consensus fact making is more and more. Has more capital right now as a form of communication.
Yeah, I agree. I don't mean to jump all the way back to an earlier conversation, but I had a question that's been picking in my brain that I wanted to ask. And when we were talking about the LSD studies and going from case-based research to randomized controlled trials, I was thinking about the fact too that I wanted to ask your opinion on whether you thought that maybe the change in opinion moving towards more randomized controlled trials and experiments could be with the fact that with pharmacological research, you can a lot of times you can just see a switch the difference. LSD is one of those things. You take it and something is happening and everybody knows something is happening. Excuse me. Whereas just psychotherapy or psychoanalysis could take 20 hours of one-on-one patient time to
or more
find some. Yeah, exactly. Some people are in it for years, right? And so do you think maybe that could be where the pushback started to come, is that now we've got something where it's well, we can see this difference pretty quickly, so maybe we should be able to measure it one-to-one like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of ways that sort of played out. One, yeah, absolutely. When there were blinded trials done, and they attempted to do double-blind trials, but people kept, breaking blind because, anecdotally, I'll use my own. Okay, I don't know if there's robust evidence. Anecdotally, volunteers would come in. Sometimes they got paid for it, but would come in and were pissed off when they got the placebo. Here, have some orange juice. Meanwhile, your buddy is listening to the Doors and he's floating through space. You're
that's awesome.
Yeah. So there were people who complained that they didn't get the active dose, and there were researchers also who said come on, it's really obvious who's getting the active dose and who's getting the Benadryl version. Maybe you feel a little drowsy, something, but they couldn't find a good approximate that still qualified for effectively blinding the trial. So that was one issue. The other one, relatedly, is that people over time, as word about psychedelics got out and that there was this, fun factor, people were lining up for trials, I think, and I, again, somewhat anecdotal evidence, but through correspondence with researchers at the time, were saying I think people are using this for a safe place to have an experience.
Right.
So it's not the same as evaluating what they would say is a naive drug user's experience. Okay, tell me what really happened. They're oh, this compared to the time that I was at this other place. They're starting to compare. They're starting so users, consumers, clients, subjects, patients are building their own sort of experiential repository of these of LSD, for example. And we also know that there were some enterprising chemistry students or amateur chemists who were making their own supplies and were also coming to some of these trials or case rooms for their own experiences to compare with their own supplies. So there were other projects kind of underway behind the scenes or in the underground that confounded the capacity to sort of produce clean or authentic clinical evidence that they could use to evaluate, because people came in for different purposes, which isn't to say that doesn't happen in trials today. And I don't know that everyone's listening to Jimi Hendrix when they go in for a psychopharm trial. But we know that, obviously trial participants are drawn from populations, perhaps even people who need them. So it just sort of, I think for me, psychedelics are not proving the point, but they're, like Aldous Huxley would say, they're doors. They're a doorway to perception rather than the perception itself. Studying psychedelics for me is a way of using that as a window into, well, how do we evaluate scientific or clinical evidence? How do we classify human suffering? When does it get bad enough that we decide that we are collectively going to pay the state to help to treat it, or when is it not that way? That's what psychedelics are for me, is that window into these kinds of questions, not the answer.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, I don't have we don't have much more time. I did want to ask though, just two more questions. I know I said I wouldn't go through my list, but these were topics I wanted to cover.
No
What is what does Tier 1 Canadian Research Chair mean?
Yeah, I think, bad historian. I think it was like 2000, maybe the year 2000, that the federal government introduced this suite of research chairs, which means that the federal government secures a certain proportion. So Tier 2s are, you can have them for up to 10 years. You have to be within 10 years of your PhD, and it's to really stimulate early career researchers in getting independent research careers off the ground. So like independent, I mean just like principal investigators, so like running your own lab in the scientific context, or developing a research program in a humanities context or social sciences. And then Tier 1 is the sort of senior to that, so you have to be at least 10 years out of your PhD. And have amassed a international reputation for research, et cetera, et cetera. So
Wow. And you hold that position in health and social justice, the history of health and social justice?
yeah. I had a Tier 2 in history of medicine, and then changed the title to sort of bring in that social justice component as well. And also within history of medicine, this gets a bit nerdy, but like history of medicine, maybe sort of stereotypically, or the reputation of it is, the study of formalized medicine. So it could be doctors, hospitals, institutions, kind of imagine that. Whereas the history of health could be a little bit more inclusive. So it could include patients or nurses or home care workers, or a kind of, or even like health conditions could be the object of study rather than like something defined by medicine.
I see.
It's a bit of a loose division, but I just wanted to signal in my title that it's not just the profession of medicine or the kind of domain of medicine, but thinking about health and including that kind of those underground elements as well that certainly wouldn't be captured in medicine.
That's really interesting. And the last one I wanted to ask about was, you also studied eugenics research, is that correct? Okay. I can't keep you too long, but what was that, like before or after LSD, or like what made you after LSD research? Excuse me.
We can go a few more minutes. It's okay. Like I said, I can grab something quick. So when I finished my PhD in psychedelic history, it was 2005, and like the conversations around psychedelics at the time, in like mainstream conversations, but also in academic conversations, was not like it is today. So this was kind of like a little niche project, it seemed. And I was explicitly told by a number of colleagues, like, you better do something real.
Right.
Like, you don't want to be, in fact, I recall someone specifically saying, like, you don't want to be known as like the acid princess, or like, the professor who studies LSD or something like that. Like, that's kind of might limit your job prospects or your career options. And I'd always been interested in eugenics, which again, to me, is like, if I'm interested primarily in, things that kind of straddle this underground, above ground, they're like in a kind of liminal space of either like, having a reputation that is a bit tarnished, but also something that I feel like is really juicy and complicated. So like LSD, good, bad, under what conditions, eugenics, like, and I'm not going to say eugenics are good, but eugenics have this reputation of like, bringing science and philosophy together to like make the world a better place according to 19th century ideas. Like the control of reproduction could maximize human benefits and, stimulate evolution in interesting ways, or again, from the kind of most optimistic perspective. But on the flip side to that, what I was curious about was throughout the sort of heyday of eugenics from the late 19th century and in Canada into the 1970s, even there were two programs that existed until the 1970s. Almost throughout that period entirely, women's access to birth control, or for that matter, families' access to birth control was severely limited. It was illegal, it was criminalized. So it's illegal to use birth control, but it's legal to control the population through surgical means in, for some groups.
Yeah.
And of course, the people who were forcibly sterilized were not, they were marginalized people. Most of the people in Canada who were forcibly sterilized under the programs, so legally, were people living in psychiatric hospitals or in homes for people with low IQs, or homes for the feeble-minded is what it was called. But then there's also ricochet, sort of rippling effects outside of the official policy. So the practice extended to other marginalized groups in Canada. And we see this playing out across the country. Every province and jurisdiction in Canada had some element of kind of eugenic practices in place, although only 2 provinces had policies. So I was really fascinated by, okay, so how does this intersect with ideas about justice? Whose justice? How does it intersect with ideas about feminism? Because some of the loudest proponents of eugenic sterilization were first-wave feminists. It's like, oh, wait a second, this is going to be complicated, right? So these women are like, yay, vote! And also, let's control the population of people who were considered genetically inferior.
Well, yeah.
It's like, oh, complicated heroes, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So I was like, let's unpack this. And what it led to initially was I started working with a philosopher at the University of Alberta, and the project really blossomed under his leadership into a almost decade-long community engaged project with men and women who describe themselves as survivors of the eugenics program in Alberta. And some of them had previously formed a class action suit to sue the Alberta government, and that was settled out of court, and they weren't permitted to talk about it anymore. But we as academics and community groups and some politically engaged people and survivors got together and put together a big community engaged project with a documentary and books and a website and all this kind of thing, even a computer game. Wow. It doesn't work anymore, unfortunately. It's got a bug in it right now, but otherwise I'd recommend it. But the idea was to sort of draw attention to this past. And like you said earlier, it turned out when we started going to high schools and we did readings at public libraries, and there was a theater production put on about this, and people were like, we didn't know this had happened. And the law changed in 1972.
I was going to ask,
not, it's older than me, but not by much. So it was great in the sense that we had access to men and women who were willing to talk about their personal experiences. And that became, here again, that kind of power of anecdote, and the power of those personal stories really drew out an emotional appeal to the importance of learning this history and appreciating the consequences on people. And then we could scale from that to see, how many people did this affect? Because obviously they weren't all still alive. It started in the 1920s. And we started to ask different questions about, justice questions around the eugenics programs and the idea of eugenics lifted even from the policies. So the idea that we should or could control population growth and under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. So when is it okay to either encourage or force birth control, and when is it okay, or is it ever, to restrict birth control from some other populations? And that became a guiding principle that carried us through a couple of books.
Wow. I did not know that there was that much behind all of it. Is it true that, I don't even know where I heard this, so maybe it's just some weird fever dream or something, but is it true that the one of the guys that discovered DNA thought that the most powerful tool it would be for eugenics?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact quote, but I mean, James Watt, one of the co-founders or co-discoverers of the DNA double helix, he's been quoted for a number of really racist and horrible things that I think fall under the umbrella of eugenics for sure. And I don't remember exactly. I know there've been a few different things, but it doesn't surprise me. And it's funny, and this might be controversial to say, and especially as you'll share it, but I think that the concept of eugenics really needs to be like shaken up a little bit, and that's part of what we try to do in our work, because the word itself has this association. I mean, even often people are like, oh, that's what the Nazis did, and yes, the Nazis were involved in eugenic sterilization after Canada, interestingly enough. We did it first. Yeah. Although the Americans got there before us too, in formal policy, because there were efforts to control populations, efforts to control fertility in different ways that aren't called eugenics, but they are effectively eugenics. But it also is the language that was available for talking about birth control. And so it complicates things, because you also have, sort of prominent activists who are saying, like, we need to be able to control our bodies, especially women are saying this at the time. We need to not be dying in childbirth because we have no way, or women who have 13 children are like, I can't feed them, my body can't handle this again. So there are women who are pleading for, and they reach out and grasp onto this idea of eugenics as well. Partly because there isn't the vocabulary or terminology available to say, like, no, I mean eugenics by choice. And that gets lost, I think, in the historical maelstrom, and as particularly with the kind of, obviously with the Holocaust, overwhelming our understanding of this. And it's like all things there bad. Since then, it's better. We're more ethical now. We understand things. And I don't think that's an accurate way of kind of historically classifying eugenics, because I think there were a lot of more intricate debates about what could happen under the specter of controlling human fertility. Good and bad. And also, I think eugenic practices continued, I know they practiced coercive sterilizations in many, many jurisdictions beyond the Second World War. And it almost does a disservice to that historical record to say, well, it stopped there because everybody recognized that, what was going on in Nazi Germany was bad. Like, yes, I think we might get close to consensus on that. Yeah. But it still continued, and I think it changed the way that those surgeries were justified, and they become even more invisible to history as a result, I think, in some respects. And so that's part of what our project was about, was like trying to pull this back up into the surface and have a bit more of a conversation about, why were there proponents, who were the critics, and what did that look like? Because I don't think it's entirely gone away.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you very much. That was awesome. You surpassed all my expectations. I was so excited to talk to you. That was great. I learned so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Where can people find your work, I guess, if they want to look at your research or get in touch with you if they're a graduate student or anything? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I have a website that is like mostly up to date, and it's got my contact information. It's got a list of publications, mostly book publications on there right now. And yeah, that's probably the best way. That's the easiest way.
Awesome. I'll put it in the description of the video then.
Cool.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to cover quickly, or?
No, thanks for doing this. What inspired you to do this? I mean, you said a little bit at the beginning, but
just learning, really. I just feel like I don't know. I graduated and it was all just kind of over. I didn't want to stop learning from people like yourself, just people that have things to say and are very fascinated in their subject areas. I don't know. I'm obsessive about just gaining new knowledge about things. So that's the purpose, I guess, in its simplest form.
Cool. Yeah. Well, you should think about grad school.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I don't know. Yeah. This is pretty fun. So, yeah. But I guess
there's some history and psychology here,
Yeah. Maybe.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.